Today we're going to talk about having a superiority complex. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that, but at least I can tell you truthfully that I've been in that place a time or two. And so I wanted to talk to you about that because I don't think it's unique to me. And the text of the lesson is taken from Romans chapter 12, verse 3. This is Paul writing to the church in Rome. As your spiritual teacher, I give this piece of advice to each one of you. Don't cherish exaggerated ideas of yourself or your importance, but try to have a sane estimate of your capabilities by the light of the faith that God has given to you all. Sometimes, church, you can climb too high for your own good. I don't know if any of you have gone on to mountaintops and experienced that, where the higher you get, the thinner the atmosphere, and sometimes physical effects on your body start taking place because it is entirely possible to ascend too far, stand too tall, and to be elevated too much. If you linger too long at these higher altitudes, then at least two of your senses are likely to suffer from a medical condition called hypoxemia or hypoxia, which is insufficient oxygenation of your blood. And typically, what happens first is your hearing begins to dull. And when you have a superiority complex, the same thing happens. It's hard to hear people when you are higher than they are. Voices will seem to grow distant and sentences seem to be muffled. And then a second effect with hypoxemia is when you're up there, your eyesight can begin to dim a little as well. And when you have a superiority complex, it's hard to focus on people when you are so far above them, you just don't see them. They appear small to you, like little figures with no faces. You can hardly distinguish one from the other, since to you they all kind of look the same. In other words, you don't hear them and you don't see them because you are above them, which is exactly where David's altitude at the zenith of his reign finds him. As you know, and if you've been paying attention, we've been kind of camping out on David a little bit this past several weeks. And I wanted to go back to David because on the one hand, he is a character that is inspirational. He had a man after God's own heart, and yet on other circumstances, he was a woeful and abject failure. And so I take encouragement from studying about David because in many ways he's a lot like I am, or vice versa. Maybe I'm a lot like David. But in this particular case, David has never, ever, ever been higher. The wave of his success has now crested at about 50 years of age. Israel is expanding, the country is prospering, and in 2 decades on the throne, he has distinguished himself as a warrior, as a musician, as a statesman, and as its king. His cabinet is strong. His boundaries stretch approximately 60,000 square miles. That's a lot of territory. He has had no defeats on the battlefield. He's had no blemishes during his administration. He is loved by the people, he is served by the soldiers, and he is followed by the crowds. David is at an all-time high. Quite a contrast to how we first found David. When you first start reading about David, the first story you come to is basically him in the valley of Elah, where he's trying to scoop up 5 smooth stones to kill the giant Goliath. Then, at that point in time, everyone else stood up. The soldiers stood, Goliath stood, the brothers stood. Everybody was higher than David. And David was very low at that time, maybe at his lowest, and yet he was never, ever stronger in his faith. 3 decades later, the situation has now reversed. David is never higher, and yet David spiritually is never weaker. David stands at the highest position of his life, in the highest position in his kingdom, and at the highest place in the city, which is on the balcony of his castle overlooking the city of Jerusalem. Now, David at this point in time should be with his men in battle, but he isn't. He stayed home. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "In the spring, when the kings normally went out to war, David sent out his general Joab, his servants, and all the Israelites. They destroyed the Ammonites and attacked the city of Rabbah. But David stayed in Jerusalem." So it's springtime now in Israel. The nights are warm, the air is sweet. David apparently has time on his hands, love on his mind, and people at his disposal. His eyes fall upon a woman as she bathes, and maybe Bathsheba was bathing in a place where she shouldn't bathe, maybe hoping that David would see her, or maybe she wasn't. I mean, we just don't know. But what we do know is he looks and he likes what he sees. So he inquires about her. A servant returns with the following information. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3 tells us what the servant told David when David said, "Hey, go check out that chick. Who is she?" That woman is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And if you read between the words, you will see that the servant is very tactfully, very respectfully lacing his information with a warning. He gives not only the woman's name, Bathsheba, but her marital status and the name of her husband. Now, why would the servant tell David that she's married if it wasn't to caution David? And why give the husband's name unless David wasn't familiar with it? And the odds are David probably knew Uriah. But even if he didn't know Uriah, David would have known Eliam's dad. His name is Ahithophel. And Ahithophel is David's closest advisor in his cabinet, which, of course, would make Bathsheba his counselor's granddaughter. Do you see what the servant was trying to say? The servant hopes to respectfully dissuade the king. But David clearly misses the hint because he can't hear. And the next verse describes his first steps down a very slippery slope. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 4. "So David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him, and when she came to him, he had sex with her." That's where it went. And I want you to notice that if you go back and read, let's just say today, the book of 2 Samuel chapter 11, I want you to notice that David sends a lot in this story. S-E-N-D, sends a lot. For instance, he sends Joab to battle in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. He sends the servant to inquire about Bathsheba, verse 3. He sends for Bathsheba to have her come to him. When David learns of her pregnancy, he sends word to Joab to send Uriah back to Jerusalem. David sends him to Bathsheba to get busy, so to speak, to cover up the fact that she's pregnant. But Uriah is too noble because he's on the clock. He's not going to do that. So David opts to send Uriah back to a place in the battle where he is sure to be killed. Thinking his cover-up has been made complete, David sends for Bathsheba and marries her. That's a lot of sending. And we don't like that kind of sending, demanding David. We prefer the pastoring David, right? The one who cares for his father's sheep. Or maybe we care about the clever and the resourceful David who has made a living out of hiding from Saul trying to assassinate him. Maybe we even have a desire to see that worshiping David, the one who pens the Psalms. We aren't prepared for the David who clearly has lost control of his self-control and sins by sending. So what happened? Well, I think it's pretty simple. David had hypoxemia. He had altitude sickness. Call it a superiority complex. He's been too high for too long, and the thin air has clearly messed with his senses. He can't hear like he used to. He can't hear the warnings of his servant. He can't hear the voice even of his own conscience. And tragically, he can't even hear the voice of his Lord. The pinnacle of David's success has dulled his ears and blinded his eyes. Because you have to ask yourself the question, did David actually see Bathsheba? And I think the answer is no. He saw Bathsheba, all right. He saw her bathing. He saw her body. He saw her curves. He saw Bathsheba, the conquest. And as you know, David had a lot of marital conquests. We know of at least 8 wives that he had, and Bathsheba would be number 9. But did he ever see Bathsheba, the human being? The wife of Uriah, as the servant had pointed out to him? How about the daughter of Eliam, as the servant had also suggested to David? Did he see her as the creation of God? No, he didn't. David had lost his vision. And too long at the top of the hill will do that to you. Too many hours in the bright sun and the thin air can leave you absolutely breathless and dizzy. Of course, who among us has ever ascended as high as David? Who among us is just a finger snap away from a rendezvous with anyone that we might ever choose? Presidents, kings, maybe, they could send people to do their bidding, but we're just lucky to be able to send out for pizza occasionally, right? We don't have that kind of clout. We can understand David's other struggles, like his fear of Saul and his long stretches of hiding in the wilderness. We've been there. But David, the high and mighty, David's balcony is one place we have never been. Or have we? Now, I wasn't on a balcony, but I was in a restaurant. And I didn't watch a woman bathe, but I did watch a waitress fumble. She couldn't seem to do anything right, church. You'd order soda, and she'd bring you juice. You'd ask for an appetizer, and she'd bring you an entree, if she ever even remembered to bring the right entree. And I started to grumble. I mean, I didn't say anything out loud, but in my thoughts, I'm thinking, what is the matter with you? Unfortunately, I was feeling just a little smug at the time because I had just won at the time of trial, and to celebrate the victory, my client had invited me to lunch and proceeded to tell me what a great lawyer I was. Thank you. Because I don't know which one was crazier. The fact that he said that, or the fact that I actually believed it. So I entered the restaurant that day feeling just a little cocky. I probably even had to tilt my head a little to the side just to get through the door. And then I asked for the soda, and I asked for the appetizer, like I explained to you earlier. And this waitress blew every assignment, every one of them. So I growled. Now, in telling you that, do you see what I was doing? I was placing myself higher than the waitress because in the pecking order of a restaurant, she was below me, right? Her job is to serve, and my job was to be served. Have any of you ever felt that way? Superior to someone, maybe? A parking lot attendant, a clerk at the grocery store, the peanut vendor at the baseball game, the sanitation engineer, maybe? You've probably done what I did. And the truth is that we've all done what David did. We've lost our sight and we've lost our hearing. Because when I looked at the waitress, I didn't see a human being. I saw a server. Which begs the question, how is your hearing these days? Do you hear the servants that God sends? Do you hear the conscience within you that maybe God is stirring? Do you hear that conscience speaking out to you? And secondly, what about your vision? Do you still see people? Or do you only see their functions? Do you see people who need you? Or do you see people beneath you? To me, church, the story of David and Bathsheba is less a story about lust and more a story about power. A story of a man who rose too high for his own good, a man who needed to hear, you know, you better come down from there, David, before you fall. Interestingly, David's son, Solomon, whose mother, by the way, was Bathsheba, would later write these words in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. First pride, and then the crash. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. And that must be why God hates arrogance. He hates to see his children fall. He hates to see his Davids seduce people. He hates to see his Bathshebas being victimized. God hates what pride does to his kids. God doesn't merely dislike arrogance, he hates it. And could he state it any more clearly than in Proverbs 18 or chapter 8 verse 13? I hate pride and arrogance. And a few chapters later, in case you missed that point, it says in Proverbs chapter 16 verse 5, God can't stomach pretense. Believe me, he'll put those upstarts in their place. And church, you don't want God to do that. You don't want God to be putting you in your place. And just ask David, why? Because David never quite recovered from his bout with this particular giant. So don't make his mistake. It's better to descend the mountain on your own than to fall off of it. Pursue humility instead. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And he said something that I remember that I think is quite poignant. He once said, humility doesn't mean you think less of yourself, but that you think of yourself less. Did you hear that? Being humble doesn't mean that you think less of yourself. You just think of yourself less. The Apostle Paul said 2,000 years before C.S. Lewis in Romans chapter 12, verse 3, don't cherish exaggerated ideas of yourself or your importance, but try to have a sane estimate of your capabilities by the light of the faith that God has given to you. That was our text that we started with, Romans chapter 12, verse 3. And I think the emphasis, perhaps, should be put on the word sane, since the antonym or the opposite of the word is insane, and the definition for insanity is doing over and over the same thing and expecting different results. That quote is attributable to a fairly bright and intelligent man. His name was Albert Einstein. So learn to embrace your poverty. We're all, church, equally broken, but we're all equally blessed. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 15, it says, people come into this world with nothing, and when they die, they leave with nothing. Resist the place of celebrity. Jesus said in Luke chapter 14, verse 10, go sit in the seat that is not important. And then when the host comes to you, he may say, friend, move up here to a more important place. Then all of the other guests will respect you. So wouldn't you rather be invited up than put down? God has a cure for the high and mighty. He says, come down from the mountain, or he'll help you get over your superiority complex. And when you do, you'll be amazed at what you can see. You'll be amazed at what you can hear. And the truth is, when you pull yourself out of that high altitude, you'll be able to breathe a whole lot easier. So this week, church, see people for who they are. Children of God. They're not your servants. You don't send them places. You don't have them do things for you. You see them from the same level as you are. A child of God, entitled to respect and courtesy and honor. And we live in a time, clearly, when that is a difficult thing to accomplish. Many have opinions that are different than our own, and if our opinions should differ from theirs, then rather engaging in a civil conversation about maybe those differences of opinion, people are lately turning to adjectives to describe you. And it's tragic. But if there's one thing that remains constant, it is God's word. And if God is the one who created us, then God is the one who knows us the best. And if God hates arrogance and superiority complexes, we should as well. But we need to be very careful that we don't become what God hates, and instead have a sane estimate of ourselves so that we can live peaceably among all with whom we come into contact and worship each and every week. So this week, get off your high horse, have some humility. You don't need to think less of yourself. You just need to think of yourself maybe a little less and think of others first.